A millionaire, drunk on power, made the worst mistake of his life, slapping Michael Jordan's elderly mother in front of everyone. Laughter turned to silence. Phones started recording. But the real nightmare. Michael Jordan was watching. No shouting. No threats. Just a cold, quiet decision that would erase everything this man had built. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where you're watching from. Share in the comments below. The grand hall of the Lexington Hotel glittered under the weight of wealth. Crystal chandeliers dripped light over men in tailored suits and women draped in designer gowns. Laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses filled the air, a carefully curated symphony of affluence and influence. The annual charity gala was more than just an event. It was a battlefield of power, where connections were forged and reputations cemented. Dolores Jordan moved through the crowd with the kind of quiet grace that demanded respect. In her 70s now, she carried herself with a dignity that made her stand out even among the richest in the room. She wasn't flashy, didn't need to be. Her presence alone spoke volumes. People who knew, really knew, whispered about her, the mother of Michael Jordan, the woman who shaped a legend. Not everyone recognized her immediately, though, and one man in particular didn't care. Nathan Caldwell had built his empire on ruthlessness. He was the kind of man who walked into a room and expected it to shift around him. Money made him invincible, and tonight he was feeling especially untouchable. It started small, an offhand comment about old money being replaced by new ambition, a joke at someone else's expense, then another, the kind of arrogance that made people laugh out of obligation, not amusement. Then Dolores crossed his path. "Excuse me, dear," she said politely as she tried to step around him. Nathan barely glanced at her. "Watch where you're going," he muttered. Dolores, never one to back down from simple respect, paused. "Manners don't cost a thing," she said with a kind but firm smile. The people near them chuckled. Just a few, but enough to make Nathan feel it. His pride, a fragile thing hidden behind wealth, cracked. His jaw tightened. His nostrils flared. He wasn't used to being spoken to like that, especially not by an elderly woman he didn't recognize. "You should be careful who you talk to like that," he said coldly, stepping in closer. Dolores didn't flinch. And so should you. That was it. The trigger. The line that cut too close. Without thinking, without care, Nathan lifted his hand and slapped her across the face. It wasn't hard enough to injure, but it was deliberate, calculated, a show of power. The sound ripped through the gala. Conversations died mid-sentence. Glasses froze halfway to lips. Eyes widened, locked on the scene that no one had expected. For a second, there was absolute silence. And then, phones came out. Cameras blinked awake. The world was watching now. Nathan, seeing the attention, scoffed. "Relax," he said with a smug smirk, adjusting his cufflinks. She was getting in the way. People shifted uncomfortably. Some looked outraged but said nothing. Others exchanged glances, unsure whether to intervene or pretend they hadn't seen it. That's how power worked in these rooms. It made people hesitate. But Nathan had made one miscalculation. Unseen, unnoticed, standing near the balcony, Michael Jordan had been watching the entire thing. His face was unreadable. His body language gave nothing away. But his eyes, they held a storm. Michael had learned a long time ago that power wasn't about volume. The loudest man in the room was rarely the strongest. No, real power moved in silence. He could have reacted instantly. He could have crossed the room in seconds, confronted Nathan, let the world see his rage. But that wasn't his game. Not yet. Instead, he watched, calculated. Nathan still had no idea who Dolores was, no idea what storm he had just invited into his life. As the tension thickened, Dolores took a deep breath, standing tall despite the insult. She didn't touch her cheek, didn't give Nathan the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, she held her head high, her silence more powerful than words. Someone stepped forward. Jordan's assistant, Garrett West. A tall, composed man who understood exactly how these things worked. He leaned in close to Michael and whispered, "Should I handle it?" Michael didn't look away from Nathan. His voice was calm, measured. "No." A pause. Then, softer. "Not here." Garrett nodded, immediately understanding. This wasn't going to be about a public spectacle. Michael was smarter than that. This was going to be something else entirely. Across the room, Nathan, still oblivious, scoffed again. "This is a charity event," he said with exaggerated exasperation. "Let's move on, shall we?" He turned his back to Dolores, already dismissing her as irrelevant. The mistake of a lifetime. Michael exhaled slowly, a controlled breath. He adjusted the cuff of his suit, the same way he used to adjust his wristbands before dominating on the court. Nathan thought he had just silenced an old woman. He had no idea he had just started a war. And Michael Jordan? He never lost. The air inside the Lexington Hotel ballroom remained thick with tension. The moment had already passed. At least that's what Nathan Caldwell believed. He had slapped an elderly woman, humiliated her in front of some of the most powerful people in the city, and then dismissed it as if it were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. And why wouldn't he? That's how the world worked for men like him. Money erased sins, arrogance masked weakness, and a carefully placed smirk could turn any wrongdoing into a forgotten afterthought. Nathan adjusted his suit, laughing as he clinked glasses with the men around him. Men who knew better than to challenge him. "You see that?" he chuckled, shaking his head. "That's the problem with people like her. They think respect is owed to them just for existing. Someone needed to put her in her place." A few of his associates chuckled uneasily, but not out of genuine amusement. No one wanted to be the one to stand against him. Not yet. Across the room, Michael Jordan hadn't moved. His expression hadn't changed. His hands remained clasped in front of him, his stance as unreadable as ever. Years of high-stakes competition had taught him one thing above all: control. People often mistook silence for inaction. They thought the quiet man in the room was the weakest. They assumed that if you weren't the first to react, you weren't planning to react at all. Nathan had no idea how wrong he was. Michael slowly leaned toward his assistant, Garrett West. His voice was low, deliberate. "Shut him down." Garrett didn't need any further explanation. He nodded once and immediately stepped away, his phone already in his hand. Michael finally exhaled, calm and patient, as if he had all the time in the world, because in reality, he did. Nathan, still oblivious, swirled the whiskey in his glass, watching as the evening continued. To him, the slap was over and done. It was a momentary disruption, nothing more. People would forget soon enough. They always did. But something had shifted. It started small, whispers moving through the crowd, a ripple effect as people who did recognize Dolores Jordan quietly exchanged glances, murmuring among themselves. The weight of the name Jordan carried more power than Nathan had anticipated. His smile faltered when he noticed the shift. The energy in the room felt different. He frowned, glancing around. "What?" he muttered, irritated by the sudden unease he couldn't quite place. "Why is everyone acting like I just committed a crime?" No one answered him. Then his phone buzzed, a text from his financial advisor. "Call me, now." Nathan rolled his eyes. Probably some meaningless business detail. He ignored it. A minute later, another buzz. This time, a message from his lawyer. "We need to talk. Urgent." He clenched his jaw, his annoyance deepening. What was going on? Still, he ignored it. Michael, meanwhile, had moved toward the bar. He wasn't drinking. He simply observed the way he always had, like a predator watching its prey unravel. Then came the final message. From his CEO. The subject line alone sent a jolt through Nathan's spine. "Stock plummeting. Media crisis incoming." His hands tightened around his glass. What the hell? His pulse quickened as he clicked open the news app on his phone. And then, there it was. A video. Crystal clear, high definition, his slap, his smirk, his arrogance, trending, exploding, everywhere. The headline was devastatingly simple. Nathan Caldwell publicly assaults Dolores Jordan, mother of NBA legend Michael Jordan. Nathan's stomach dropped. Michael hadn't lifted a finger. He hadn't said a word. And yet, in a matter of minutes, the world had turned against him. The people around him started shifting away, subtly but noticeably. No one wanted to be associated with him anymore. His reputation, his empire, was built on perception, and right now the world was perceiving him as a monster. The real panic set in when he checked his stock price, down 8% in 15 minutes. His hands began to sweat. Nathan turned sharply, looking around the room, trying to locate Michael. He spotted him near the bar, standing still, his expression unreadable. The billionaire swallowed hard. For the first time that evening, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Fear, because he finally understood something chilling. Michael Jordan wasn't going to argue with him. He wasn't going to call him out. He wasn't going to demand an apology. He was going to erase him. Nathan's breath came quicker. He forced himself to move, stepping toward Michael, attempting to regain control. "Jordan," he called out, trying to sound composed. "This is ridiculous. Let's talk." Michael turned to face him, but his eyes weren't filled with anger. They were calm, icy, calculated. "I don't talk to nobodies," he said simply. The words landed harder than any slap ever could. Nathan's jaw clenched, his ego flaring. "You think you can do this? You think you can ruin me just because I put some old woman in her place?" Michael's expression didn't change. Nathan scoffed, shaking his head. "This will pass. People forget. Money talks. Ow." His phone buzzed again. A final text. From the chairman of the board. "Pack your things. Effective immediately, you're out." The world spun. His company, his position, gone. Nathan's vision blurred. This couldn't be happening. Not to him. Not like this. His hands trembled as he tried to speak, but no words came. He had already lost. Michael let the silence stretch, watching him crumble. And then, after a long pause, he finally leaned in, voice barely above a whisper. "You should have known better." Nathan staggered back, breath shallow. Michael gave him one last look before turning away, his job done. Because that was the thing about power. Real power doesn't have to raise its voice. It just takes. Nathan Caldwell woke up to the faint vibration of his phone on the nightstand. The soft glow of the screen illuminated the darkened room, casting long shadows across the silk sheets of his king-sized bed. He squinted at the clock. 4:37 a.m. A call at this hour wasn't normal. With a groggy sigh, he reached for the phone. It was his CFO, Richard Mallory. Nathan let it ring for a moment before answering, his voice thick with sleep. "This better be good." Silence on the other end, just for a second. Then Richard's voice came through, tense and clipped. "Nathan, we have a problem. A big one." Nathan ran a hand over his face, exhaling sharply. "Go on." "We lost the Levington deal. The investors pulled out." That got his attention. Nathan sat up, his mind clearing fast. The Levington deal was a $50 million contract, one of the biggest development projects in his portfolio. It had been a sure thing, a done deal. "What the hell are you talking about? We closed that deal last week." "Not anymore," Richard said grimly. "They backed out. Something spooked them." Nathan swung his legs over the bed, gripping the phone tighter. "Who?" Richard hesitated. "They wouldn't say." Nathan clenched his jaw. This wasn't just a hiccup. This was deliberate. Still, he forced himself to stay calm. "It's a fluke," he muttered, standing up. "We'll get them back. Money talks." "That's not all." Nathan stiffened. "What now?" Richard exhaled heavily. "Vanguard International just withdrew from our European expansion project. They're citing unforeseen market volatility." Nathan felt a cold weight settle in his chest. That wasn't possible. Vanguard had been on board for months. They needed this deal as much as he did. He grabbed his robe and strode toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the city skyline. The first light of morning was creeping in, but there was no sense of calm. "Who else?" he demanded. Richard hesitated again. "Richard," Nathan snapped. "The Sentinel Group is considering pulling out, too." Nathan's fingers tightened around the phone. 3 deals. 3 massive deals. Gone. His mind raced. This wasn't random. Someone was moving against him. But who? Nathan took a slow breath, forcing his voice into something steadier. "All right, schedule meetings with each of them. I'll handle it." "Already tried," Richard said. "They won't take your calls." Nathan went rigid. That never happened. For the first time in years, something unsettling slithered into his gut. Fear. By mid-morning, Nathan was in his office, pacing. The floor-to-ceiling windows of his Manhattan high-rise no longer felt like a symbol of power. Instead, they felt like walls, closing in. His assistant, Laura, knocked and stepped inside. "Sir, I've reached out to the Sentinel Group's CEO. He won't speak directly, but his office says business priorities have shifted." Nathan scoffed. "That's code for something." "Yes, sir," Laura said, voice careful. "And there's something else." She hesitated. "What?" Nathan snapped. Laura swallowed. "The press is asking about your incident at the gala." Nathan rolled his eyes. "That's old news." "No, sir," Laura said. "It's not." She turned the iPad toward him, displaying a headline. "Nathan Caldwell's empire in jeopardy. Major investors back out after public controversy." The article was brutal. It wasn't just about the slap. It was about his entire reputation, his business tactics, his arrogance, his enemies, all laid out like a carefully assembled hit piece. Nathan barely processed Laura leaving the office before he slammed his fist onto his desk. This wasn't just a scandal. This was a takedown, and he knew exactly who was behind it. Michael Jordan. He sucked in a breath, forcing himself to calm down. Michael wasn't the type to make public statements. He wasn't the type to go on the attack. Which meant he didn't have to. His influence was enough. His name alone was enough. Nathan checked his phone. 12 missed calls. 12 unanswered messages. The cracks in his empire weren't just appearing. They were spreading. Nathan Caldwell sat in his office, staring at the endless stream of notifications lighting up his phone screen. His fingers hovered over the device, hesitating for the first time in his life. He had always been the one in control. Deals bent to his will, money answered every problem, and apologies were something other people gave. But today, the rules had changed. He hadn't heard from Michael Jordan. Not a call, not a statement, not a single public reaction. Yet Nathan could feel him everywhere. It was in the way investors refused to return his calls, in the way his name had begun to rot in the headlines, in the way social media was tearing him apart, one hashtag at a time. Respect Dolores Jordan. It had started as a ripple, then grew into a wave, and now it was a tsunami. Celebrities, athletes, influencers, people who had never cared about him were suddenly invested. Disgusting. Who does that to someone's mother? Dolores Jordan is a queen. Nathan Caldwell is trash. Bet he wouldn't have done that if he knew whose mom she was. Coward. The worst part, Nathan knew they were right. Still, he had spent a lifetime refusing to acknowledge mistakes, and he wasn't about to start now. He grabbed his phone and called Richard, his CFO. The line rang once before Richard picked up. "We're bleeding out," Richard said without preamble. "Stock dropped 7% overnight." Nathan clenched his jaw. "We can handle 7%. That's nothing." Richard's silence was deafening. Nathan felt his stomach tighten. "Richard, we're down 12% now." Nathan's grip on the phone tightened. He turned toward the giant screen on his office wall and pulled up the live stock ticker for Caldwell Enterprises. His breath hitched. Down 14%. His empire, The one he had spent years building was crumbling in hours. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "Scandals come and go. This shouldn't be happening." "Michael Jordan doesn't play by the rules," Richard said grimly. "He doesn't need to say a word. His silence is speaking for him." Nathan cursed under his breath. This was different. This wasn't the press hounding him for a statement or angry tweets from nobodies. This was money moving, and money moving meant power shifting. "Fix it," Nathan ordered. "Talk to the board. Talk to our PR team." "It's not that simple," Richard interrupted. "The board is in panic mode. You need to be prepared for the possibility that they—" Nathan slammed his fist on the desk. "They wouldn't dare." Richard didn't respond right away. "They would if they thought you were a liability." Nathan's heart pounded. His empire had never felt fragile before, but for the first time, he understood what it meant to be hunted. By noon, the headlines had only gotten worse. Every news station, every website, every finance blog was running with the same deadly narrative. Caldwell Enterprises in freefall. Can Nathan survive? His name had become toxic. Brands were distancing themselves. Investors were scrambling. Even his closest allies, the ones who had always defended him, were silent. Nathan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. His office, once his fortress, now felt like a prison. His phone buzzed, a text from an anonymous number, just 2 words. "Check again." Nathan frowned, his fingers moving instinctively. He refreshed the stock ticker. The number plunged before his eyes. Down 20%. His chest tightened. This wasn't just a crisis. This was a collapse. Nathan Caldwell had faced bad press before. It came with the territory of being rich, ruthless, and unapologetic. He had always known how to turn the narrative in his favor, throw money at the right people, make a few calls, and silence the noise. But this time, the silence wasn't coming. This time, the noise was getting louder. Sitting in his penthouse office, he scrolled through news headlines, each one worse than the last. Nathan Caldwell faces backlash after publicly disrespecting Michael Jordan's mother. Caldwell Enterprises stocks tumble as CEO faces widespread outrage. Boycott Caldwell, public demands accountability. Every outlet, CNN, Forbes, The Wall Street Journal, was covering it. Even sports networks had picked it up, turning a single slap into a national controversy. But it wasn't the media that scared him the most. It was the silence from his allies. By mid-afternoon, Nathan was on the phone with his PR strategist, Julia Hastings. "Fix this," he snapped. "Issue a statement. Turn the attention on something else. Leak a scandal if you have to." Julia hesitated, and that alone made Nathan's pulse spike. She was never afraid to be blunt, which meant something was wrong. "Nathan," she said carefully, "we're losing control of the narrative. Every major brand connected to you is reconsidering their partnerships." Nathan gritted his teeth. "So, money talks. Offer them double." A beat of silence. Then Julia said, "They're not interested." Nathan shot up from his chair. "What do you mean they're not interested?" Julia sighed. "Nike, Citadel, even the private equity firms backing your expansion. They don't want their names tied to yours. The backlash is growing faster than we can spin it. People aren't just mad, they're disgusted." Nathan clenched his fists, trying to steady his breathing. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. By evening, the problem had escalated into a full-blown crisis. Nathan had always believed billionaires couldn't get canceled. But what if they could be abandoned? His assistant, Laura, walked in, looking unusually pale. "The board wants an emergency meeting," she said, avoiding his gaze. Nathan laughed bitterly. "Let me guess, they're looking for a way to cut me loose." Laura didn't answer. That was answer enough. Nathan exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of his desk. His empire was built on power, on the perception of invincibility. If his own board was questioning him, it meant they saw weakness. He had underestimated the weight of Michael Jordan's silence. Jordan hadn't said a single word. And yet, Nathan was falling apart, and the worst part? He wasn't sure if there was anything left to stop it. The board of directors had gathered on short notice, their faces unreadable, but Nathan could feel it, the shift in power, the quiet rebellion brewing beneath their forced professionalism. He had seen it before in boardrooms where he had dismantled weaker men who thought their positions were safe until he decided otherwise. But today, he was the one being sized up. The tension was suffocating. Gregory Langston, the company's chief financial officer, cleared his throat. "Nathan, I'll get straight to the point. The situation is deteriorating faster than we anticipated." Nathan leaned back in his chair, feigning indifference. "Deteriorating? That's dramatic. The media cycle will move on. They always do." Gregory hesitated, exchanging glances with other board members. "Nathan, this isn't just media noise anymore. It's a full-scale financial crisis." He slid a folder across the table. Nathan opened it, skimming the contents, his stomach tightening. 3 banks had withdrawn their financial backing. Not just any banks, the ones funding his major expansion projects. Nathan's mouth went dry. "This is temporary," he muttered. "They'll come back once they realize how much money they're walking away from." "They're not coming back." This time it was Patricia Holt, one of the senior board members. Her voice was calm, but the finality in her words was unmistakable. Nathan's jaw tightened. "They wouldn't do this without a reason." Gregory sighed. "They have a reason. You." Nathan scoffed. "That's ridiculous. One scandal." "This isn't just a scandal," Patricia interrupted. "This is a structural collapse. Our stock is down 31% as of this morning. Investors are liquidating their holdings. We lost nearly $500 million in market value in the last 48 hours, and now the banks have pulled out. Do you know what that means?" Nathan said nothing. Patricia pressed forward. "It means we can't secure funding for ongoing projects. It means every construction site, every overseas investment, every pending deal, it's all frozen." Nathan's heart pounded. This was worse than he thought. He had assumed this was just another PR storm, that he'd ride it out like he always had. But this wasn't a storm. This was an earthquake. And his empire, a house of cards, and the wind was blowing. Hard. Outside the glass walls of the boardroom, the office was eerily quiet. Employees who usually moved with urgency now walked cautiously, whispering in hushed tones. They had seen the news. They knew what was happening. Nathan glanced toward the glass, catching glimpses of worried faces quickly turning away when they noticed him looking. His grip on the folder tightened. "You're all overreacting." "We're not," Gregory said. "We're protecting the company." Nathan's eyes snapped back to him. "My company." Silence. A silence so heavy it felt like gravity itself had shifted in the room. Nathan stared at the board members, suddenly seeing them for what they were. A pack of vultures. Waiting. Watching. And then Patricia slid another document across the table. Nathan didn't pick it up. He didn't have to. He knew what it was. A motion. A vote. To remove him as CEO. Nathan let out a slow, measured breath. "You ungrateful cowards." Patricia didn't flinch. "Nathan, we have no choice." He leaned forward, voice razor-sharp. "You always have a choice. You're choosing self-preservation." Patricia's gaze remained steady. "And so are you." Nathan's fingers curled into fists, but he forced himself to relax. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him unravel. Gregory cleared his throat. "Let's proceed with the vote." The board members exchanged glances. Then, one by one, they raised their hands. Nathan watched, his pulse pounding. 1 hand, 2, 5, 10, every single one of them. Unanimous. Nathan Caldwell had just been voted out of his own company. He sat there, frozen, as reality crashed down. The empire he had spent decades building? Gone. 30 minutes later, Nathan stepped into his private elevator, the cold steel doors sliding shut behind him. His reflection stared back at him from the polished metal walls. He barely recognized himself. For the first time in his life, Nathan Caldwell had lost. His empire was crumbling, his name was poison, and the people who once hung on to his every word were now running from him like he was a plague. The board had voted him out. Investors had abandoned him. Banks had cut him loose. He was no longer Nathan Caldwell, billionaire mogul. He was just another man who had fallen from grace. His hand trembled as he picked up his phone. For the first time in years, he hesitated before making a call. His whole life, people answered to him, not the other way around. But now, he was out of options. He exhaled, pressing the call button. The line rang once, then twice, then click. A voice, deep, steady, and unreadable. Michael Jordan. Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Nathan felt his throat tighten, but he forced himself to speak. "I think we need to talk." More silence. Then Michael's voice, cold and measured. "Now you think." Nathan closed his eyes. He had expected anger, maybe even a mocking tone. But this was worse. Michael didn't sound angry. He sounded like he had already decided how this would end. Nathan cleared his throat, pushing down his pride. Look, I know things got out of hand. I know what happened at the gala was a mistake." Michael didn't respond. Nathan exhaled, gripping the phone tighter. "But what's happening to me right now? You and I both know it's gone too far." Michael finally spoke, his voice quiet but sharp. "You think I did this to you?" Nathan hesitated. He knew the answer. But admitting it, that was something else. "I don't know," he said carefully. "I just know that ever since that night my life has been falling apart." Michael let out a low breath. Almost a laugh, but not quite. "You're looking for someone to blame," he said. "That's your problem, Nathan. You think someone else is always pulling the strings." Nathan felt his pulse quicken. "Are you saying you had nothing to do with it?" A beat of silence. Then, "I didn't have to." Nathan's stomach twisted. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing toward the window. "Michael," he said, his voice lower now, almost desperate. "You and I both know how this world works. I've pissed people off before. I've been through scandals. But this is something else. My own board turned on me. Investors are acting like I'm a leper. My name is being erased from my own company. This doesn't just happen." Michael's voice remained steady. "It does when you deserve it." Nathan let out a bitter laugh. "Come on, man. A slap? That's what did this." Michael's voice finally hardened. "You didn't just slap a woman. You slapped my mother, in front of the world, and you thought you could just walk away from it." Nathan swallowed, his throat dry. He had known from the second his hand struck Dolores Jordan's face that he had crossed a line. But he had spent his entire life buying his way out of bad decisions. This time, there was no price tag big enough. Nathan let out a slow breath. "Michael, I don't want war." Michael didn't hesitate. "Then you shouldn't have started one." Nathan clenched his jaw. "I didn't think." "That's your second problem," Michael cut in. "You never think, because you never had to." Nathan's free hand curled into a fist. He had been humiliated. He had lost everything. And Michael was sitting there speaking to him like a child who needed a lesson. But wasn't that exactly what had happened? Nathan swallowed his pride. What was left of it anyway? "Look," he said, his voice quieter now. "I messed up. I know that. But you and I both know this isn't just about an apology. I need to fix this." Michael exhaled, and for the first time his tone shifted. Not softer, not forgiving, just different. "You don't fix something like this with a phone call." Nathan closed his eyes. "Then how?" A pause. Then Michael's voice, calm and absolute. "You figure that out yourself." Click. The line went dead. Nathan stared at his phone, heart hammering in his chest. Michael hadn't just refused to help him. He had left him to drown. Nathan Caldwell arrived at the private suite of the Lexington Hotel, a place where billion-dollar deals were usually sealed with a handshake and a glass of aged whiskey. Tonight, there was no deal to be made. No cameras, no reporters, no lawyers, just two men and a reckoning. The weight of his own downfall sat heavy on his shoulders as he stepped into the dimly lit room. Michael Jordan was already there, seated on the far side of the room, his posture relaxed but unreadable. Nathan had spent his career commanding rooms, bending men to his will with sheer force of presence. But this room didn't belong to him. Michael didn't stand, he didn't greet him, he didn't need to. Nathan swallowed hard, forcing himself to walk forward. The silence pressed against him like a vice, making each step heavier. Finally, he spoke. "Michael, sit." The word wasn't a suggestion. Nathan hesitated, then obeyed, lowering himself into the chair across from Michael. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Michael's eyes studied him, measured, calm, unshaken. He didn't need to speak first. He had already won. Nathan licked his lips, hands clenched together. "Look, I know things—" Michael cut him off with a slight tilt of his head. "Let's skip the part where you pretend this is about things." Nathan inhaled sharply. He had walked into this meeting prepared to negotiate, to reason, to find an angle. But sitting here, across from Michael Jordan, there was no angle. Just the truth. Nathan exhaled, forcing himself to drop the act. His voice cracked slightly when he spoke again. It was a mistake. Michael leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Number? It was a choice." The words landed like a hammer. Nathan flinched. He had spent his life making choices that only served himself, never caring about the consequences. But now, for the first time, he was being forced to face them. Michael let the silence stretch, letting him feel the weight of it. Nathan's throat tightened. "I didn't realize who she was," he admitted, his voice quiet, almost desperate. "I didn't think—" Michael's eyes darkened. "That's the problem, isn't it?" Nathan's stomach twisted. Michael sat back, exhaling slowly. "You don't get to sit here and act like this was some misunderstanding. You knew exactly what you were doing that night." Nathan looked away, unable to hold his gaze. Michael continued. "The difference is, you didn't expect consequences." Nathan let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "I've lost everything." Michael remained unfazed. "And?" Nathan's head snapped up, anger flickering in his eyes. "And," he repeated, "my company, my reputation, everything I built is—" Michael leaned in again, his voice calm but sharp. "Everything you built?" He let the words hang, then added, "Or everything you took." Nathan's breath caught. Michael sat back, watching him. "You're not here because you lost. You're here because you thought you were untouchable. And now you're realizing you're not." Nathan felt something he hadn't in years. Shame. Silence stretched between them once more. Finally, Michael stood. "You want me to fix this?" Nathan swallowed hard, his pride screaming at him to say no, but desperation overpowering it. "Yes." Michael nodded slowly as if considering it. Then, "No." Nathan's face fell. "Michael?" Michael turned toward the door. "You don't get to walk away from this clean." Nathan shot up from his chair. "Then what do I do?" Michael stopped but didn't turn around. His voice was quiet, final. "Figure it out." Then he walked out, leaving Nathan alone with the wreckage of his own choices. The final nail, 1,400 words. Nathan Caldwell had never been on the wrong side of a camera before. For years, the flashing lights had been his stage, the interviews his playground, the headlines his personal kingdom. He dictated the narrative, controlled the message. But tonight, he was the story. The studio lights burned hot against his skin as he sat stiffly in the center of the frame. A sleek, polished news desk separated him from the journalist across from him, Lisa Crowley, a woman known for her sharp, unforgiving interviews. Millions of people were watching. Not investors, not business partners, Not shareholders, the public. And the public wanted blood. Nathan adjusted his suit jacket, masking the slight tremor in his fingers. His throat was dry, his heart pounding. He had done difficult things before, closed billion-dollar deals, outmaneuvered ruthless competitors, crushed entire industries under his boot. But this was humiliation. Lisa Crowley didn't waste time. As soon as the cameras went live, she turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Nathan Caldwell," she began, her voice crisp, professional. "A month ago, you were one of the most powerful businessmen in America. Today, you sit before us a man without a company, without a board seat, and, if the rumors are true, without the financial empire you once controlled." Nathan swallowed, forcing himself to keep eye contact. "That's correct." Lisa didn't blink. "You know why you're here." Nathan exhaled slowly. "I do." She leaned forward slightly. "Then let's not waste time. Do you take responsibility for what happened the night of the charity gala?" The question hit like a hammer. It was the moment. Nathan's fingers curled slightly against his lap. He wanted to fight, to defend himself, to remind the world that men like him didn't bow. But the world had already reminded him otherwise. His voice, when it came, was quieter than he intended. "I do." Lisa didn't react. No nod of approval. No softening of her gaze. "Then say it," she pressed. "Say what you did." Nathan's pulse pounded against his temple. He had prepared for this moment. Had rehearsed it with his publicist, gone over the wording a dozen times. But sitting here in the heat of the cameras, he realized nothing could prepare him for how it would feel. His mouth felt dry. His voice cracked slightly. "I disrespected Dolores Jordan," he admitted. "I humiliated her in a way that was unacceptable. I made a terrible mistake." Lisa remained stone-faced. "A mistake?" Nathan's jaw clenched. "A choice," he corrected, his voice barely above a whisper. Lisa let the silence stretch. She wanted him to feel it. And he did. Nathan shifted slightly in his seat. "I take full responsibility for what I did." Lisa's gaze remained locked on his. "Do you?" Nathan inhaled slowly. "Yes." She finally leaned back in her chair, exhaling. "Then tell me, Mr. Caldwell. Why now? Why are you sitting here today, admitting this, after weeks of silence?" Nathan hesitated. "Because I lost everything. Because the world turned against me. Because I have no other choice." None of those answers would help him now. Instead, he forced out the only one that mattered. "Because I was wrong." Lisa studied him. For the first time, something in her expression shifted. Not sympathy. Understanding. She knew this wasn't redemption. This was surrender. Across town, in the quiet comfort of her home, Dolores Jordan watched. She sat on her couch, a cup of tea in her hands, the television casting a soft glow across the dimly lit room. She had lived through many things. She had seen injustice, endured hardship, and faced moments that tested the very fabric of her patience. And tonight, she watched a man, a powerful man, brought to his knees, not by force, but by the weight of his own actions. She didn't smile. Forgiven? Maybe. Forgotten? Never. For years, he had walked into rooms where deals paused mid-sentence the moment he arrived. People stood when he entered, laughed at his jokes, nodded in agreement before he even finished speaking. His name alone could turn failing ventures into gold, open doors that remained shut for others. Now his name was a liability, a whisper people avoided saying out loud. Nathan sat alone in the corner of a nearly empty cafe, a baseball cap pulled low over his face. Just 6 months ago, he wouldn't have dared to step foot in a place like this. Too common, too quiet. But the high-end restaurants where he once reserved tables without a second thought now acted like they had no idea who he was. It had started slowly at first. Subtle shifts in the way people spoke to him, in the way calls went unreturned. Then the real fallout came. One by one, doors had begun to shut in his face. His first attempt to regain footing had been through old connections. Men he had built fortunes with, men who owed him favors. He had called one of them Henry Lawson, a longtime business associate. Henry had picked up on the third ring, his voice wary. Nathan? Nathan had forced a smile. Henry, it's been too long. Let's grab a drink. We should talk about a few opportunities. Silence. Then a sigh. Nathan, I can't. Nathan's grip tightened on the phone. What do you mean? You can't? I mean, it's complicated. There's too much heat around your name right now. Nathan let out a bitter laugh. Henry, it's not complicated. Either we're business partners or we're not. Another pause, then Henry's voice came quieter, almost regretful. We're not. The line had gone dead, and just like that, another door had closed. The worst part wasn't just losing money, it was losing relevance. He had spent years shaping industries, controlling narratives, deciding who thrived and who disappeared. But now, he was the one disappearing. His name had been erased from his own company. The penthouse office where he had once stood, surveying the skyline like it belonged to him, was now occupied by someone else. His personal assistant, Laura, had quit 2 months ago. When he had asked why, she had simply said, "I need to work for someone with a future." The words had stung more than he'd admitted at the time. Now, sitting in the corner of this cafe, drinking coffee that tasted like nothing, he finally understood what she meant. Once the hunter, now the hunted. A group of young professionals sat at a nearby table, talking in hushed voices. At first, Nathan wasn't paying attention. But then, his name. "Caldwell used to own half of downtown, right?" one of them said, stirring his drink. A woman across from him scoffed. "Yeah, and look at him now. What an idiot." Nathan went still. The man smirked. "Classic case of thinking you're too big to fall." The woman shook her head. "Honestly, he deserved it. He thought power meant you could treat people like trash. Now, he's nobody." Nathan's stomach twisted. He wanted to stand up, to remind them who he was. But who was he, really? A name people whispered, a cautionary tale, a ghost of a man who used to matter. The studio was dimly lit, the air humming with quiet anticipation. The cameras were rolling, but the moment felt bigger than television. This wasn't just another interview, it was a closing chapter. Michael Jordan sat across from the interviewer, his posture relaxed, his presence commanding without effort. He had nothing to prove. He never had. The interviewer, a seasoned journalist named Daniel Whitmore, leaned slightly forward, studying the man before him. "Michael," he began, "the world watched as Nathan Caldwell's empire collapsed. The scandal, the fallout, the apology. And through it all, you never said a word. You never responded. You never struck back." Michael's expression remained unreadable. Daniel pressed on. "Most men in your position would have sought revenge. They would have made sure someone like Caldwell never recovered. But you let him unravel on his own." He paused, then asked the question everyone had been waiting for. "Why didn't you destroy him completely?" Michael exhaled slowly, a faint hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. And then he gave the simplest, most devastating answer. "Some people destroy themselves." The words landed with weight, filling the room with an unshakable truth. Daniel let the silence stretch before leaning back in his chair. "You really believe that?" Michael nodded, his tone steady. "I didn't have to ruin Nathan Caldwell. He did that all by himself. His own arrogance. His own choices." He shrugged. "All I did was watch." Daniel studied him. "So, this wasn't about revenge?" Michael tilted his head slightly, considering the question. "I've never been interested in revenge," he said finally. "I'm interested in lessons." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "And what lesson did Caldwell learn?" Michael's gaze darkened, but his voice remained calm. "That power isn't about what you can take. It's about what you can keep." Daniel nodded slowly. the weight of those words settling in. The interview wrapped shortly after, but Michael's answer would echo far beyond the room. Because in the end, he never needed to destroy Nathan Caldwell. Nathan had already done it for him. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the quiet neighborhood. The air smelled of freshly cut grass, a warm breeze rustling the trees. Birds chirped lazily as the day inched toward evening. Dolores Jordan sat on her front porch, a steaming cup of tea resting between her hands. She rocked slowly in her chair, her gaze fixed on the horizon, though she wasn't really looking at anything in particular. She was thinking about the past, about the present, about the way life had unfolded in ways both expected and unexpected. She had always known who her son was, not just as an athlete, not just as a businessman, but as a man. She had raised him to be more than just great. She had raised him to be good. And tonight, as the world settled from the storm of the past few weeks, she felt a quiet satisfaction. Not in Caldwell's downfall. That wasn't what this had ever been about. But in the fact that Michael had handled it the way she knew he would. With power, with restraint, with dignity. She took a slow sip of her tea just as the front door opened behind her. She didn't need to turn around. She already knew who it was. Michael stepped onto the porch, his footsteps light but firm. He was always steady, always composed, always carrying himself with that same quiet confidence that had defined him since he was young. Without a word, he lowered himself into the chair beside her. For a while, they just sat there. No conversation, no need to fill the silence. The wind rustled the trees again, the sound soft and steady. Finally, Dolores turned her head, studying her son. Michael stared straight ahead, his expression calm, thoughtful. There was no pride in his eyes, no lingering satisfaction over what had happened to Nathan Caldwell, only understanding. Dolores smiled, just a little. She reached over, placing a gentle hand on top of his. Michael finally turned to her, and in that single moment, nothing needed to be said. She was proud of him, and he understood. Michael gave a small, slow nod. Mission accomplished. Power isn't about what you have. It's about what you deserve to keep. One mistake, one moment of arrogance, and an empire crumbled without a single punch thrown. Actions have consequences. Some are loud. The worst ones, silent. Think you know power. Think again. Stick around, because the next downfall might be even greater.